Wow, that's a big statement. This whole thing is so mind blowing, and as mind blowing as your first appearance, this chart especially is really freaking me out. Like looking at the mortality of all the animals, the mass extinction event that must have taken place. One of the things that always bothered me about that idea that human beings killed off the woolly mammoths is that they found these vast fields of uneaten mammoths where there was thousands of them that had died almost instantaneously.
Yeah.
Which is just, that doesn't make any sense. Like, what did they do? They went on a mass killing orgy of slaughter and then just decided not to eat any of them?
Well, the field evidence itself is inconsistent with that idea. Right here, this is an example. This is one of the many mammoth cemeteries. And what happens is that you can see here that you can see from the shoreline, see that there was a flood. The river rose up to this level, and then when it rose down, it left this in its wake. And what you see here, like this is bone counting at the Berlik Mammoth Cemetery in northern Yakutia, Siberia. Identical deposits are found throughout the Taymyr Peninsula. And what we see here is these massive bone deposits that have been showing up for the last couple of hundred years. Every time that there's, a thawing or a flood, or these things are washed up on the shore of the Arctic Ocean, what we see is that there were huge, huge herds of woolly mammoths grazing where now the plant material is only 2 inches high. So clearly it was a completely different climate there. What's interesting is that you had in Siberia able to support herds of woolly mammoths at the same time that half of North America is buried under 2 miles or more of ice.
How is that possible? Just a totally different atmosphere.
I'm still puzzling over that. I have some ideas, but, until I can test these ideas a little further, I'm...
So without ice core samples, is it impossible to figure out what the temperature was in Siberia at that time?
No, they can figure out basically based upon fossil plant remains. Mm-hmm. And you can see that in some cases the tree line was hundreds of miles further north than it is now. And that's clearly, if you've got trees, forests growing now where, 13 or 14 or 15,000 years ago it was permafrost, you know it was warmer, clearly.
So there's still, whoa, what is that? 19th century scene showing ivory floor of the London docks covered by thousands of mammoth tusks from Siberia. This is a drawing, obviously.
Yeah. This
predates photographs.
Yeah. For hundreds of years, thousands of mammoths, entombed mammoths, and mammoth tusks were being exhumed from the Siberian permafrost. Thousands and thousands and thousands of these. And basically, to me, you look at this is just in-your-face evidence that this was not humans doing this. It was not humans that were slaughtering these mammoths and burying their remains.
Well, it's the instantaneous nature would almost be like people had figured out some new thing, like they figured out some like a doom gun, they they shot the whole
the doom gun. Well, look at the near extinction of American bison. What brought that about? Trains and high-powered rifles, right? It was a major technological advancement that was able to bring about the near extermination of the American bison.
There's actually a guy that I'm going to bring on the podcast soon to discuss that. His name's Dan Flores, who is in a big chunk of his intellectual career studying this. And what he believes is that the bison had a massive population jump that was directly correlating to smallpox epidemic, the Native American people. And that when the United States... when we look at the United States history, and the big stacks of woolly mammoths, the big stacks of bison skulls that we always look to, like that was a very unusual population of bison that existed because the Plains Indians had experienced this massive extinction event. And then when they had incorporated the horse, like the horse and apparently the American Indians, the Native Americans rather, were on their way to extirpating the bison even before we came along. But then they died off in this massive death scenario with smallpox and all the different diseases that the Europeans had brought over here. And then the mammoth population, the bison population had grown like almost unnaturally. It had been much larger than it had ever been in the past. and that's when the United States was established, and that's when all the Western European immigrants had come along and started killing off all these bisons. It's really a very interesting subject, and
it's an interesting idea, and it's plausible. I haven't looked into that. I had assumed, and maybe wrongfully, but I had assumed that the bison population had been relatively stable. I am not convinced, though, that there was this massive die-off of the Native American population yet. I'm not convinced. Maybe,
really?
Well, because I haven't looked into it yet. But one of the things I have seen is that the assumption there is predicated upon that the Europeans arrived and brought the diseases that Native Americans had no defenses for. But the thing is that there's so much evidence now showing that there were lots of explorers and immigrants to the New World prior to the arrival of the Europeans. Whether it was the Chinese, the Phoenicians, and I'm not necessarily saying that's credible. None of it's been proven, but there's some interesting data out there that suggests, and there are a number of books written that, again, I haven't accessed it. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm an authority on that, because I'm not. But if some of that turns out to be credible, it would suggest that there was a lot more interaction between the Native American population and other groups around the world, which, if true, to me, kind of somewhat undermines this idea that they were, completely susceptible to the introduction of these, to these foreign diseases. But again, I've got an open mind. I'll wait and see. I'd like to see what he says. I'd like to hear his ideas.
For anyone interested, he has a paper in the Journal of American History. It's called Bison Ecology and Bison Diplomacy, the Southern Plains from 1800 to 1850. I just looked for it online. There's a preview that's available, but to download the entire paper or book, I'm not sure which one it is, it's $19.
Yeah, and what journal is it in?
The Journal of American History from September of '91. And like I said, he's working on a new book right now, and I'm trying to get him to come in, but it's very difficult while he's in the middle of
You said September of 1991?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can probably access
Dan Flores is his name,
okay.
And just the information that I got about it was pretty mind-blowing.
Okay.
But
sounds interesting. I want to know more. Thank you for that, Joe.
Yeah, please. Now let's go back to that photo that you have on your desktop that you were going to explain to me, but we decided not to talk about it before the podcast because it's so incredible. That you said all of this incredible change that we're looking at, the geological structure, all that took place within just a week.
Yeah. Let's go to this. We'll come. I've got that. We'll come to that. This is a satellite photograph taken from about 500 miles up, and what you see here, this is southeastern Washington, and what you're looking at here is part of what's called the Columbia Basalt Plateau. This is part of the terrain that we crossed when I was with Graham. What you see here is that you have an area of, if you look here, you can see differentiate between the pixels and the actual squares. That, like you see, this red area down here is area that's actually being farmed, and it's because this is an infrared photograph, and so what happens is that the areas that are being cultivated will show up warmer than the surrounding areas. This whole plateau is covered in this stuff called loess, Loess, and it's a type of very fertile soil that has a rather mysterious and controversial origin. We won't get into that right now, but in some places this loess layer is hundreds of feet thick over a dark basalt bedrock that is the result of these massive outflows of basaltic lava that came out, that extruded between about 6 million and 16 million years ago, right? The hot spot that was the ultimate origin of this basalt is now where Yellowstone is, so you can make that connection here. The Yellowstone supervolcano, yeah. But what you have here is that you have the lighter areas is where this loess topsoil still exists, and the darker areas is where the the underlying dark basalt is showing through because the loess was washed away. So what this is your typical, the geological term is anastomosing, and basically that means a branching flow pattern of the water. And you can see that very clearly here, that the water came off of this river, which is the Columbia River up here, and flowed over the landscape and washed away the basalt and left these gigantic channels in its wake. And there's more over here to the east, there's more over here to the west. And if we look at actually this, let me go to a different program here. I think that'll actually have some, that actually I think has the picture in it that you were seeing. Now, what we're looking at here is what's been called the Missoula Flood, right? Named after the town of Missoula, Montana. Missoula is in a basin that was part of this hypothesized giant lake that presumably caused this flood, right? And again, there was an ice dam. There was this ice dam. The ice dam broke, and as soon as this thing comes up, I will be able to show you some slide. Here we go. Let's see. Here we go. It should be coming up right here. While that's coming up, we'll look at this slide right here, because this will kind of give you a picture of the Earth as it was during the height of the Ice Age.
So wow, that's pretty deep. The sheets of ice go pretty far down. That's amazing. Canada didn't exist.
Canada didn't exist.
Wow.
Yeah.
Poor Canadians.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the ice, part of it is, a lot of in the Midwest now, a lot of, the farming belt of America is basically, growing out of the fertile soil that the ice scraped off of Canada and dumped, down in Minnesota and Iowa and Wisconsin and so on. So, someday they may want that back, but we're not going to let them have it.
It's fascinating when you look at that there was this big ice cap, but then the areas around it, no ice. And why was that?
Well, that's one of the mysteries. Again, like over here in Siberia,
yeah.
You can see over here, this is where all the woolly mammoths were, giant herds of woolly mammoths. And it appears like it may have been warmer than now during the Ice Age, which is very odd.
There's some ice up there? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, there's some ice up there. Sporadic glaciers, but nothing like what we see in northwestern Europe over here. This was called the Fennoscandian ice sheet. And the ice sheet over North America actually consisted of two ice sheets. The Laurentide, which was centered over Hudson Bay, and the Cordilleran, which was centered over the Canadian Rockies. And in this particular slide, you can see here, this was the Cordilleran over here, over the Canadian Rockies, and this was the Laurentide was much bigger, see? And then there was an area between the two, right here, which has been theorized as, at one point, having been a corridor called the Ice-Free Corridor, and migrants from Paleo-Indian migrants from Siberia would have come across Alaska and down through this corridor here to the lower United States, and ultimately down here to South America. And it was that group, these groups of bands of Paleo-Indian hunters that, according to the overkill or blitzkrieg hypothesis, wiped out the mega mammals as they passed by. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here, this kind of will show the coastlines of the world during the Ice Age, and let me just escape out of this so that we can zoom in a little bit and look at it closer. Okay, so here would be, as we see now, and
this is modern coastlines.
This is modern coastlines. And now I'm gonna jump to, this is actually only 300 feet lower than now, and quite a bit different. Let's just look at the United States, North America.
That's amazing. There's a lot more United States.
Yeah, now check this out. Okay, now here's North America as it is now. And you see up here, this is the Bering Strait right here between Alaska and Siberia, right? During the Ice Age, this whole area was exposed because of the lowered sea level. And we'll go one slide further and you will see. Take a look now. Watch what happens up there in Beringia. Boom.
Wow, so it's all land.
It's all land, and it's connecting North America to Siberia, and that's all drowned.
Wow, I didn't understand that. See, I always thought that the Bering Strait was an ice mass. I thought it was during the Ice Age that there was some sort of
yes,
that it was ice, but it's not. It's land.
No, it's land.
Wow.
And it's not glaciated, and it was home to these extraordinary herds of mega mammals that ranged over these thousands and thousands of square miles. I mean, the drowned area is bigger than modern Alaska.
So how long ago is this?
Well, this is, right at the end, up till the end of the Ice Age. Between like 14, 15,000 years ago.
So 14, 15,000 years ago, no glaciers in this area. This is all just land, and there's animals living in it, and people are walking back and forth. Essentially, it was a continent. I mean, it was connected. It was all one continent. It was all one.
It was all one continent.
Wow, that's amazing.
And not the coastlines of the world. Look at Florida down here.
Wow.
It's double the width of the modern peninsula.
Yeah, it's enormous. And it's so close to Mexico, too. It's almost like a little boat ride.
Now, here is Indonesia, and, where stories, which I don't know how credible they are, but, there are stories like Lemuria in the Pacific and all of that. Again, I don't know how credible those are. I think the Atlantis story actually has a little more credibility. We talked about that last time somewhat. But here's the modern, and you can see the light blue is the coastal shelf area, right? Now, let's go back. We're going to drop sea level 300 feet, and then you'll see here the enormous change.
Whoa.
So again, enormous areas of land were drowned by the rising sea levels. Remember this. Now, when we look at the rise of modern cities and modern civilizations, where did they first show up?
On the coasts.
On the coasts, right. At the mouths of rivers, on the coastlines. And during the Ice Age, where would have been the most obvious prime habitable real estate? Down close to sea level, right? So if there were cities built, if there were thriving communities during the Ice Age, they're now 400 feet under the water.
It's so amazing that all of these stories of floods, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah's Ark, that all of these stories seem to really correlate with all this data. I mean, they all seem to coincide.
That's exactly the point.
It's so weird. Most people would think about the story of Noah's Ark, like, oh, it's just some crazy old horse shit. But it's most likely they're basing it on something that happened very rapidly in their area.
Yeah. Now, of course, we're most familiar with the story of Noah's Ark, because of the Judeo-Christian tradition. But there are literally hundreds of stories from all over the world that parallel the story of Noah. Deucalion, Xisthros, Utnapishtim, Manu. The list goes on and on of these culture heroes that somehow had foreknowledge of this impending disaster and were able to take steps to preserve themselves, their family, some diverse cross-section of species, and they all have this, similarity. They all parallel. Now, my way of looking at it is this. Okay, we now know from the hard geological record that massive floods have taken place on the surface of the earth. Massive floods, right? Beyond anything that we have even imagined, right, up until a decade or a few decades ago. They're real, okay? On the other hand, we have stories and myths and legends repeatedly. It's probably the most ubiquitous of all the stories that we've inherited from the past, is this story of this gigantic world-destroying flood that occurred, right? Now, on the one hand, we have the hard geological record, which shows there were giant floods. Then we have these epic tales and myths from all over the world about giant floods. Do we now dismiss those floods, those stories out of hand and say, oh, that's just superstitious, pre-literate, pseudoscientific nonsense? I think we'd be making a big mistake to do that. Now, if we accept that those flood stories, and maybe they have been altered through the time and through the telling, represent something real, what about the other elements of the story? The fact that in so many cases there was somebody that had foreknowledge. Do we dismiss that out of hand as well? You know, or where does that come from? That there was one group of people, small group of people, that saw this thing coming and prepared for it, and others who basically paid no attention.
Maybe they were just preppers. Maybe they're just the preppers of 10,000 years ago.
The preppers of 10,000 years ago.
On those
I think
TV shows.
that explains it right there. One last slide quick here. Here's Europe, and look at the British Isles. Right? Now we'll drop sea level. No British Isles.
That's incredible.
See, that's what I was saying earlier when we started talking. I mean, the world of 15,000 years ago was so dramatically different than our modern world that, you know, it's almost difficult to conceive until you start looking at things like this.
And this was all during the Ice Age.
Yes.
And so the melting of the glaciers just changed everything as we know it. And this is while human beings were absolutely alive. So.
Absolutely. No question. Human beings were alive, yes. Okay. So we'll start looking at some of these pictures here. This is from western Montana. You know, it says in Genesis 7:19, the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills were covered. I want you to take a look, because you can see many mountains in western United States, if you know what you're looking at, that have this on them. You know what those are? Those horizontal lines?
They look like where the shore.
They're shorelines. Exactly, they're shorelines.
That's absolutely what they are?
That's absolutely what they are. They're shorelines. Wow. Reaching right up to the very tops of the hills, you see. And basically what you had was you had this enormous gush of water filling these mountain valleys almost to the mountain peaks and then draining away. And as it drained away, it left this succession of shorelines etched into the hillside.
Wow.
And all along the pathway of the floods, we're going to see stuff like this. This was our first stop with Graham. This is La Tourelle Falls. This is that basalt I was talking about. Look at this stuff. There's layers of this basalt.
Well, that's you guys underneath it?
I don't think in this picture. I think I took this picture about 10 years ago. But yeah, I have pictures of me and Graham under there.
Well, dude, you're so tiny. That's so crazy. It's so big.
Right. Now, here's what you've got to picture, Joe. Picture you've got this nice, gentle valley with a nice river, very pastoral scene, you know, trees and stuff, probably, you know, mammoths and herds of these animals grazing along the side of this peaceful river with gentle valley slopes. Here comes this massive flood, and we're talking about perhaps a flood wave 800 to 1,000 feet high coming through. As it comes through, it's ripping up everything in its path. And what it does is it now changes the profile of this valley from this gentle profile to down cutting 800, 1,000, 1,200 feet or more into the bedrock, right? So now, prior to the passage of this giant flood, you had streams and nice little rivers flowing into the main river, which in this case was the Columbia. What happens is after the passage of this flood wave, it sheared off the sides of the channel. So now, rather than a gentle slope, you've got sheer cliffs 400, 500, 600 feet high. These pre-flood streams and rivers come up, and they're now waterfalls. And that's what we're looking at right here in this picture, if that makes sense to you. And you notice how you've got this undercutting here. That undercutting only occurs when you have enormous, intense turbulence in the water doing this. You see, the water doing this will undercut. See, this modern waterfall here had nothing to do with the creation of this cliff. This cliff was cut, again, probably in a matter of days to weeks by the passage of these giant floods. And there's dozens of these waterfalls that are left. And these are called hanging valleys. They can be produced by glaciers, but they can also be produced by enormous, intense flood waves. This is your typical, not typical. This is a bar, a gravel bar, but in this case it's a boulder bar. Now if you've ever done any walking along a river or a creek or along the beach and you've seen ripples in the sand, and they're typically, you know, if you've got water that's a foot or 2 feet deep, you'll have ripples that are maybe an inch or two high. What we're looking at here is a flood bar that's 3 miles long. It's up to 250 feet above the modern river. And the ripples that you can see here are up to 50 feet in height and 350 feet in wavelength. This was produced, again, by gigantic flood flows. And if we look right over here, that's a 3-story building you see right there for scale.
Oh, wow.
So this gives you an idea. It's features like this that are just unequivocal in terms of realizing that this is not pseudoscience. This really happened.
And does this date back to a very specific time?
Yes, to this 13,000 year.
So it's everywhere. Everywhere
Yeah.
you're seeing this. You're seeing it geologically. You're seeing it in ice cores. You're seeing it in fossils. You're seeing
Yes, yes.
Wow.
This is evidence of the big meltdown.